Welcome back to Once Upon Yesterday, the podcast where we dust off the history books and bring the past back to life. I'm your host, James. In our last episode, we looked at the rise of the Roman Republic, how Rome threw off its kings, built a system of shared power, and tried to guard against the rule of any one man. The Republic was proud, resilient, and for centuries, it worked. But today, we're looking at the other side of that story, the fall of that republic, and the rise of Julius Caesar. The very system designed to keep ambition in check was undone by ambition itself. This episode is a political thriller. Backroom deals, personal armies, broken friendships, and betrayal in the Senate. We'll see how cracks in the foundation, inequality, corruption, and violence opened the door for strong men like Marius, Sulla, and finally, Caesar. And we'll follow Caesar's journey from popular politician to superstar general in Gaul, to the moment he gambled everything at the Rubicon and changed Rome forever. The Republic began with men swearing Rome would never again have a king. But as we'll see, by the time Caesar was done, that promise was already broken. So let's step back to the late 2nd century BCE, when Rome looked unstoppable on the surface, but its republic was already beginning to crack. So let's set the stage. Rome, 133 BCE. On the surface, the city is thriving. It's a place where marble temples gleam in the sun, markets overflow with goods hauled in from every corner of the Mediterranean, and senators in spotless white togas stroll through the forum, looking like they're about to film a political commercial. But just like that Instagram influencer, whose life looks perfect until you notice the GoFundMe link in their bio, Rome's republic wasn't as flawless as it appeared. Here's the problem. Rome had been on a winning streak for centuries, conquering enemies, seizing new lands, and dragging home mountains of wealth. Victories in wars against Carthage, Greece, and others had made Rome the ultimate superpower of the Mediterranean. But all that wealth didn't get spread evenly. It funneled straight into the pockets of Rome's elite, the senators and aristocrats who already had more villas than they knew what to do with. Meanwhile, the backbone of the Republic, the small farmer, was crumbling. These were ordinary citizens who fought in Rome's wars, came home, and were supposed to pick up the plow again. Except, after years away, they'd often return to find their land neglected, swallowed by debt, or just straight up taken by wealthy neighbors. Imagine serving your country overseas for a decade, and then coming back to find Zillow has repossessed your house and Jeff Bezos has bought your street to build another mega mansion. This shift created a new class divide. On one side, the optimates, the aristocratic elite who wanted to keep things exactly the way they were. Thank you very much. On the other, the plebeians, the common citizens who were increasingly angry about being squeezed out of land, money, and political influence. Enter the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. Think of them as the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren of the Roman Republic. They looked around, saw wealth inequality tearing the state apart, and said, maybe, just maybe, ordinary Romans deserve a piece of the pie. Tiberius, the older brother, pushed for land reforms. Break up the giant estates and give the land back to poor citizens. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, the Senate didn't think so. They branded him a radical, tensions boiled over, and in 133 BCE, a mob of senators and their followers literally beat him to death with clubs. Not exactly the thoughtful debate you'd hope for in a republic. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus picked up his brother's torch. He not only pushed for land reform, but also tried to provide cheap grain for the poor and extend citizenship to more Italians. For a while, he was incredibly popular. But once again, the Senate was not having it. Violence erupted, and Gaius met the same tragic end. Here's the key takeaway. Rome had discovered a new political tool: violence. Before this, disagreements were supposed to be settled with speeches, votes, and tradition. Now, if you didn't like what someone was proposing, you could just bash their head in. It's like if today's political debates ended not with fact checks, but with folding chairs in the Senate chamber. And the Republic never really recovered from this shift. The deaths of the Gracchi signaled that politics in Rome had crossed the line. Reformers were dangerous. The Senate was ruthless. And blood could and would be spilled in the name of power. So even though Rome still looked like the most successful city on earth, its foundation was beginning to rot. Inequality was widening, trust in the system was collapsing, and ordinary Romans were learning that the Republic wasn't built to serve them anymore. It was built to serve those at the very top. And once ordinary people lose faith in their government, they start looking for strong leaders, men who promise to stand up for them, even if it means breaking the rules. And that is the opening act in the story that will eventually bring Julius Caesar onto the stage. So, after the Gracchi brothers were taken out in a cloud of clubs and chaos, Rome had a new normal. Politics could be violent, reform was risky, and trust in the Republic was fading. And into that gap stepped a new kind of power broker: men with armies. See, for centuries, Rome's military had been made up of citizen farmers. You owned land, you served when called, you fought your wars, then you went back home to tend your olives or vineyards. Nice and neat. But as land inequality grew and small farmers disappeared, fewer citizens qualified to serve. Rome needed soldiers, but the old system, it wasn't working anymore. Enter Gaius Marius. He was a brilliant general, a man from outside the old aristocratic circles, and he came up with a bold solution. He reformed the army so that poor Romans, or men who didn't own land, could enlist. Instead of needing property to qualify, all you needed was 2 arms, 2 legs, and the ability to march. Sounds practical, right? And it was. Suddenly, thousands of men who had nothing to their names signed up for the legions. Rome's armies swelled in size, discipline, and effectiveness. Marius was hailed a hero. He saved the Republic's military machine. But here's the twist. Soldiers now weren't fighting for Rome, the Republic, they were fighting for Marius, because he was the one who promised them pay, plunder, and most importantly, land when they retired. Loyalty started to shift away from the Senate and toward individual generals. It's kind of like if your boss was also the person paying your rent, buying your groceries, and promising you a retirement home. Who are you going to be loyal to? Your boss, not some vague company mission statement. And once soldiers became personally loyal to their generals, Rome was in trouble, because generals started realizing, wait a second, if my men fight for me, not the state, then maybe I can use them to get what I want. And that brings us to Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Rome's first, I've got an army, so deal with it, politician. Sulla was a patrician, a member of the old elite, and a brilliant but ruthless commander. In 88 BCE, he was given the command of Rome's army to fight a major war in the east. But then, thanks to backroom politics, the command was reassigned to Marius. Sulla didn't take that well. Instead of shrugging his shoulders and writing an angry letter, he did something unthinkable. He marched his legions that were supposed to defend Rome, into Rome, against its own citizens. Imagine a U.S. general today being told that he's reassigned, and instead of saluting and moving on, he turns his army around and marches straight into Washington, D.C., tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue, soldiers storming Congress, not to protect democracy, but to seize it. That's what Sulla did. And here's the kicker. He got away with it. He stormed the city, drove out Marius and his allies, and declared himself in charge. Then, after a while, he actually left, went off to fight his war, and Rome sort of limped along in his absence. But a few years later, he did it again. Another march, another seizure of power. This time, he didn't let go. He declared himself dictator, rewrote laws to give the Senate more control, purged his enemies in a bloody hit list known as the proscriptions, and then, when he had his fill of power, he retired. Seriously. He just walked away, bought himself a villa, and spent his last years writing his memoirs and enjoying a quiet country life. Now, on the one hand, that sounds almost refreshing, like a dictator who knew when to leave the party before it got awkward. On the other hand, Sulla set a terrifying precedent. He proved that if you had an army, you didn't need the Senate or the people or the old Republican traditions. You could just take power by force. And once one man does it successfully, it's only a matter of time before others try the same playbook. Men with ambition, charisma, and legions at their backs. So by the time Sulla was sipping wine in retirement, Rome wasn't really the same republic it used to be. The Senate was weakened, the people were restless, and ambitious generals were taking notes, ready to try their hand at power. One of these young men, watching and learning, was Julius Caesar. He saw exactly what personal armies could do, and trust me, he was going to use that lesson. Rome had gone from noble farmers defending their homeland to professional armies loyal to individual generals. The Republic is wobbling, the Senate is flailing, and people are looking for strongmen. A perfect time for a certain ambitious Roman to make his debut. Enter Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was born in 100 BCE into an old but not particularly wealthy patrician family. Think of it as old money with no actual money left. His family name still carried weight, but his bank account, not so much. Caesar grew up with status, but without fortune to back it up, which in politics is like having a famous last name, but still needing roommates to cover the rent. From the start, Caesar had three big assets: charm, brains, and sheer ambition. He was charismatic, people liked him, whether he was mingling with the elites at a banquet or giving fiery speeches to ordinary Romans in the forum. He had political savvy, knowing how to make allies, when to bend, and when to push. And most importantly, he had drive. Caesar wasn't aiming just to be another senator. He wanted to be the senator, the man, the top dog. But he had obstacles. Early in his career, Rome was dominated by Sulla, the same dictator we just talked about. And Sulla did not like Caesar. In fact, Caesar was married to the daughter of one of Sulla's enemies, and the dictator ordered him to divorce her. Caesar flat out refused. Bold move. Sulla was furious and confiscated Caesar's property, stripped him of his inheritance, and put his life in danger. Caesar had to flee Rome and live on the run, basically couch surfing his way through the provinces. And here's where we see that early spark of Caesar's destiny. Most people in his position would have quietly divorced, kept their head down, and played it safe. But Caesar risked it all on principle and somehow survived. A few influential friends convinced Sulla to spare him. Sulla reluctantly agreed, but he reportedly said, "In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses." In other words, watch out. This kid could be trouble, and he was right. Caesar began rebuilding his career step by step. He served in the military, earning distinction in campaigns in Asia Minor. In one famous incident, he was kidnapped by pirates while sailing across the Mediterranean. Now, most people would be terrified, pleading for their lives, maybe plotting an escape. Not Caesar. He treated the pirates like annoying house guests. He joked with them, demanded they raise his ransom because he was, quote, worth more, and even joined in their games. Then, after he was freed, he came back with a fleet, captured them, and had them executed. Cold, ruthless, and a little bit humorous. Back in Rome, Caesar launched into politics. He became known for his dazzling speeches and for championing the cause of the populares, politicians who claimed to fight for the common people against the elite. He sponsored games, festivals, and public works, often going deep into debt to keep the crowds entertained. This was Rome's version of buying votes with pizza and concert tickets, and it worked. Ordinary Romans adored him. But the debts piled up. By the time he was rising through the ranks, Caesar owed so much money that he was practically bankrupt. He needed powerful backers to keep him going, and he found them in two men, Crassus and Pompey. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, so rich that if your house caught fire, one of his agents would show up and offer to buy it on the spot. If you sold, his private fire brigade would put out the flames. If not, well, we hope you had good insurance. He bankrolled Caesar's career, basically acting as his financial sponsor. Pompey, meanwhile, was Rome's golden boy general. He had won wars in the east, cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, and returned home to a hero's welcome. He was powerful, popular, and ambitious, but he needed allies in Rome's cutthroat politics. Together, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed what historians call the first triumvirate. Think of it like a political supergroup. Pompey brought the military prestige, Crassus brought the money, and Caesar brought the charm and the connection with the people. Each man thought he was using the other two for his own advantage, and together, they basically ran Rome from behind the scenes. Now, the Senate hated this arrangement. They saw it as a threat to their own authority, and they weren't wrong. But there wasn't much they could do. With wealth, armies, and popularity on their side, the triumvirate was unstoppable. And in this arrangement, Caesar found his chance to break out as the star. He was given command of Rome's northern provinces, with the job of keeping an eye on Gaul. Most senators probably thought, perfect, let Caesar babysit some barbarians in the backwoods for a few years. That'll keep him busy. But Caesar had bigger plans. He was about to use his new post to launch the campaign that would make him a household name across Rome, and set him on a collision course with Pompey, the Senate, and the entire Republic. So, Caesar has his big break, command of Gaul, the wild lands north of Italy. And when I say wild, I mean from the Roman point of view. To them, Gaul was full of fierce tribes, strange customs, and people who didn't bother with togas. Romans thought of it like we might think of the Wild West in old movies, untamed, dangerous, and ripe for conquest. Most senators probably expected Caesar to sit up there, keep an eye on things, and maybe fight off the occasional raid. But Caesar? He wasn't the type to just babysit barbarians. He looked at Gaul and thought, this is my stage. This is where I'm going to make myself famous. And oh boy, did he. For nearly a decade, from 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar launched campaign after campaign across Gaul. He fought tribes that the Romans had never been able to subdue, crossed rivers and forests thought impassable, and led his legions into battle after battle. His victories were staggering. He claimed to have killed or enslaved over 1 million people and subdued nearly all of Gaul under Roman control. Now, we need to pause here and say Caesar was brilliant, yes, but also ruthless. When tribes resisted him, he often crushed them with shocking brutality. Mass executions, whole towns burned, survivors sold into slavery. So while Rome cheered his victories, those victories came at a horrific human cost. But back in Rome, he was a sensation. And here's why. Caesar didn't just fight wars, he marketed them. After every major campaign, he sent back written reports to the Senate. These were the commentaries on the Gallic War. Now, if you're picturing dry military memos, forget it. Caesar wrote them in a clear, dramatic style. Short sentences, gripping detail, always casting himself calm, decisive, and brilliant. It was part war report, part autobiography, part PR campaign. And it worked. Romans devoured these stories. Imagine if a modern general was live tweeting their victories in real time, except with better Latin and more statues erected in their honor. Caesar was shaping the narrative, turning himself into the Republic's greatest hero, while his enemies in the Senate could only grit their teeth and watch. One of the most famous episodes from these wars was his showdown with Vercingetorix, the charismatic Gallic chieftain who managed to unite the tribes against Rome. In 52 BCE, at the fortress of Alesia, Caesar faced his greatest test. Vercingetorix had tens of thousands of warriors holed up inside the city, with even more Gauls outside ready to relieve the siege. Caesar and his men were stuck in the middle. So what did Caesar do? The obvious. He built two massive walls of fortifications, one around the city to keep Vercingetorix in, and the other facing outward to keep reinforcements out. That's 25 miles of wall, ditches, towers, traps, the kind of engineering project that makes you wonder if Caesar secretly had a side hustle with Home Depot. The final battle was brutal. Waves of Gallic warriors hurled themselves against the Roman lines. Caesar himself, clad in his red commander's cloak, rode into the thick of the fighting, rallying his troops. At one point, the Romans were on the brink of collapse, but Caesar led a counterattack that turned the tide. In the end, the Gauls were crushed. Vercingetorix surrendered in dramatic fashion, riding out on horseback and laying his weapons at Caesar's feet. He was taken prisoner, dragged back to Rome, and eventually executed in Caesar's triumphal parade. The message was clear. Caesar had not only conquered Gaul, he had made himself the new Alexander the Great in Roman eyes. And here's the thing. All of this glory came with money, rivers of money. The loot from Gaul, gold, slaves, land, poured into Caesar's coffers. He could pay off his massive debt, reward his soldiers with bonuses, and still have enough to fund lavish games and feasts for the Roman people. By the late 50s BCE, Caesar wasn't just a general. He was a rock star. His soldiers adored him because he shared in their hardships, he marched with them, ate their rations, and even joked with them around the campfires. They would follow him anywhere, and the Roman masses adored him too, because he delivered victories, celebrations, and handouts. But not everyone was cheering. In the Senate, Caesar's enemies were panicking. A general with a loyal army, overflowing wealth, and unmatched popularity, that was dangerous, very dangerous. And one of the most nervous men was none other than Pompey, Caesar's old ally, the other pillar of the triumvirate. At first, Pompey and Caesar had worked hand in hand. They even sealed their alliance with marriage. Caesar's daughter, Julia, was married to Pompey. But when Julia died in childbirth, the personal bonds between them broke, and as Caesar's fame in Gaul grew brighter, Pompey's began to dim. The two men, once allies, now eyed each other like rivals, and soon the Senate would exploit that rivalry, setting the stage for the next act, Caesar's returning from Gaul to face off against Pompey, and the Republic itself. By the end of the 50s BCE, Caesar was a superstar. He had conquered Gaul, paraded riches back to Rome, and written himself into history with his commentaries. His soldiers loved him, the people adored him, and the Senate, well, the Senate was sweating through their togas. And most of all, Pompey was sweating. Remember him? The golden boy general, once Caesar's ally, now his rival. Their friendship had curdled into suspicion. The Senate, many of whom were terrified of Caesar's popularity, leaned heavily on Pompey, essentially saying, "Hey Pompey, you're still the great general, right? You can keep Caesar in check for us, right? Right?" But here's the problem. Caesar's term as governor of Gaul was ending. By Roman law, when a governor's term ended, he had to disband his army before returning to Rome. If Caesar did that, he'd walk back into the city, a private citizen, without the protection of office or legions. And the moment he did, his enemies in the Senate were ready with lawsuits, prosecutions, and political exile. In other words, disband the army, and Caesar's career, and possibly his life, was finished. Caesar knew it, his soldiers knew it, and so did Pompey. The Senate passed an ultimatum. Caesar must give up his command and return home, alone. Pompey, in turn, was given control of the Republic's forces to make sure Caesar obeyed. This was the ultimate standoff. Caesar faced a choice: obey the Senate, surrender everything he had built, and likely fade into obscurity, or defy the law, keep his army, and march on Rome itself. And so, we come to a small, shallow river in northern Italy, the Rubicon. It wasn't wide, it wasn't deep, more of a stream, really, but symbolically, it was enormous. The Rubicon marked the legal boundary between Caesar's province and Italy proper. To cross it with an army was treason. It would mean war. Picture the scene. January, 49 BCE. Caesar and his legions march south, baggage trains rattling, boots crunching in the winter mud. They arrive at the river. Caesar halts. He knows what this means. Once he crosses, and if he crosses, there's no going back. Roman historians say he hesitated. He walked back and forth on the riverbank, thinking. His officers urged caution. The men, loyal as they were, looked to him for a sign. This wasn't just his gamble, it was theirs too. If they crossed, they'd be at war not with some distant barbarian tribe, but with their own countrymen. And then, finally, Caesar spoke. According to legend, he said, "Alia jacta est." The die is cast. Like tossing dice onto a table, he was leaving his fate to chance. And with that, he ordered his men forward. They splashed across the icy water, the banners of the legions unfurling, the sound of armor clanking in the cold. And just like that, history shifted. The Republic had been challenged by one man and his army. Now let's pause for a moment, because it's easy, looking back, to think this was inevitable, that Caesar always planned to become Rome's master. But at that moment, the risk was enormous. If Pompey had stood firm, if the Senate had rallied Rome, Caesar could have been crushed. This was less like flipping a chessboard and more like going all in at poker with your last chips. But Caesar was a gambler by nature, and more importantly, he knew his opponents. The Senate was divided, nervous, full of men who talked big game but didn't always deliver. Pompey, though brilliant, was cautious. Caesar was betting that his boldness would outmatch their hesitation. And he was right. As Caesar advanced into Italy, Pompey and the Senate panicked. They weren't ready. They fled Rome, retreating to regroup in Greece. Imagine Caesar marching on Rome, not with battles raging in the streets, but with the city abandoned by its leaders. It was like showing up to fight your rival and finding out they've already packed their bags and skipped town. The Rubicon crossing was more than a military move. It was a symbol. Caesar had chosen ambition over tradition, loyalty to his soldiers over loyalty to the Republic. He'd set in motion a civil war that would decide not just his fate, but the fate of Rome itself. And here's the irony. Centuries later, crossing the Rubicon became a phrase we still use today. It means passing a point of no return. It all goes back to that winter night when Caesar looked at a shallow little river and decided to gamble everything. The Republic had been teetering for decades. Wealth inequality, violence in politics, generals marching armies into the city. But this moment, Caesar's decision at the Rubicon, was the final shove that sent it over the edge. Next up, Caesar would have to face Pompey in open war, a showdown between two of Rome's greatest generals, with the entire future of the Republic hanging in the balance. So Caesar had crossed the Rubicon. The Republic is in crisis. The Senate has fled. Pompey, Rome's former golden boy, the man who once cleared the seas of pirates and won glory in the East, is now the defender of the Republic against an old ally. It's the heavyweight title fight of the century, Julius Caesar versus Pompey the Great. Two legends, two massive egos, one republic on the line. But here's the funny thing. The war didn't start with a bang. It started with a retreat. When Caesar marched into Italy, Pompey wasn't ready. He had more troops on paper, but many of them were raw recruits, not seasoned veterans like Caesar's legions. And Pompey was cautious by nature. So instead of meeting Caesar head-on, he and the Senate bolted, packed up their scrolls and baggage, and fled east to Greece. Caesar entered Rome in kind of a stunned silence. No dramatic battle at the gates, no glorious victory march, just empty streets and abandoned offices. Imagine storming into a political showdown only to find the other side has left you a "gone to the store, be back in a little while" sign on the table. But Caesar wasn't about to waste time. He moved quickly, seizing the state treasury to pay his troops and secure supplies. Then he began the chase. He knew that if Pompey was allowed to regroup in Greece, raise more troops, and gather allies from across the Roman world, things could get very ugly. The first major clash came in Spain, where Pompey's forces had been stationed. Caesar pulled off a brilliant campaign, defeating them without even a pitched battle. Then he turned his eyes east, where Pompey himself was waiting with the bulk of his army. In 48 BCE, the two titans finally faced each other in Greece at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey had the numbers, maybe twice as many men as Caesar. Senators back in camp were already polishing their speeches about victory. Caesar, meanwhile, had fewer men, but veterans hardened by 10 years in Gaul. And more importantly, he had speed, daring, and that mysterious quality that made his soldiers follow him through fire. The battle began with both sides forming up on the plain. Pompey ordered his men to hold position, thinking Caesar's soldiers would tire themselves out charging across the field. Caesar, noticing this, told his men to stop mid-charge, catch their breath, and then keep going. It was a small adjustment, but a brilliant one. His men hit Pompey's lines fresh and hard. The fighting was brutal. Shields clashing, swords flashing in the sun, dust and blood filled the air. At a key moment, Caesar deployed a hidden reserve force that Pompey had not expected. It smashed into Pompey's cavalry, broke through, and rolled up his line. Suddenly, Pompey's grand army began to crumble. Panic spread. Soldiers fled. Senators who had been preparing for victory scrambled for their lives. Pompey himself escaped the field, riding hard toward the coast. The unthinkable had happened. Caesar, with fewer men, had defeated the Republic's champion. Pharsalus was a turning point. The Republic, as it had been, was finished. But Pompey wasn't done yet. He fled across the Mediterranean to Egypt, hoping to find support from the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. Egypt was technically an ally of Rome, and Pompey thought he could regroup there. Bad move. When Pompey arrived, he was betrayed. Ptolemy's advisors, eager to please Caesar, decided to welcome Pompey by assassinating him on the shore. They stabbed him to death in front of his own men and presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift. Here's the twist. Caesar was not pleased. In fact, he wept when he saw Pompey's head. Was it genuine grief for his old ally turned rival? Or just the recognition that Pompey's murder had robbed him of a glorious victory? Hard to say. But in that moment, Caesar showed at least a flicker of humanity, or maybe just good politics. After all, mercy looks good on a resume. And Egypt wasn't done surprising Caesar. While he was there, he got embroiled in a civil war between Ptolemy XIII and his sister, Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra. Caesar sided with her, and the two began both a political and romantic alliance. It was like a soap opera set against the burning backdrop of the Roman Republic. Caesar had helped Cleopatra secure the throne, and she, in turn, gave him both legitimacy in Egypt and a son. Though back in Rome, that relationship was controversial, to put it mildly. But the bottom of the line was this. With Pompey gone, Caesar had no real rivals left. He returned to Rome, victorious, adored by his soldiers, and holding more power than any man had dared to claim since the Republic was founded. And while the Senate tried to dress it up with titles and honors, the truth was clear. Caesar was now master of Rome, dictator not just appointment, but by reality. So Pompey is gone. Cleopatra is on the throne in Egypt. Caesar returns to Rome as the undisputed champion of the Mediterranean world. He is not just the general anymore. He's the man. But here's the tricky part. Rome wasn't supposed to have a man. The Republic was built on the idea of shared power. No kings, no dictators for life, just elected officials with term limits, checks and balances, and a lot of wrangling in the Senate. It wasn't perfect, but it kept things from falling into the hands of a single ruler. That, at least, was the plan. When Caesar came back in 46 BCE, he was unstoppable. The Senate, which had once resisted him, had now little choice but to hand him extraordinary powers. He was declared dictator, first for a year, then for 10 years, and eventually, in 44 BCE, dictator for life. That was unheard of. He had bulldozed through Rome's traditions, and suddenly the Republic looked less like a republic and more like, well, a monarchy in all but name. And Caesar leaned into it. He wore the laurel crown constantly. He sat on a golden throne in the Senate. He even had coins minted with his face on them, something Romans usually reserved for gods. If you squinted, it was hard to tell the difference between Caesar and a king. But Caesar wasn't just about symbolism. He launched real reforms too. He reorganized the calendar, fixing years of drift and creating the Julian calendar, the ancestor of the one you and I use today. Fun fact, that's why July is called July. It's named after Julius Caesar. Not a bad way to immortalize yourself, right? He also expanded the Senate, granting seats to loyal supporters from across the provinces. He gave land to veterans, relieved some debts, and opened up Roman citizenship to more people outside of Italy. For ordinary Romans, Caesar's rule meant stability and a chance at opportunity after decades of chaos. And yet, the old aristocrats hated it. To them, Caesar's power wasn't stability, It was tyranny. He had brushed aside the Senate, ignored tradition, and concentrated power in his own hands. For a people who prided themselves on having killed their last king centuries earlier, this was chilling. Whispers began to spread. Some senators grumbled that Caesar wanted a crown. During one public ceremony, someone even placed a diadem, a royal headband, on his statue. And at the festival of Lupercalia, his ally, Mark Antony, dramatically offered him a crown in front of the crowd. Caesar refused it, not once, but 3 times. Maybe it was a clever bit of theater to show he wasn't that kind of ruler, but to many Romans, the message was clear. The Republic was already dead in all but name. And so, conspiracy formed. A group of senators, calling themselves liberators, decided Caesar had to go. Among them were men Caesar had pardoned after the Civil War, including his close ally, Marcus Junius Brutus. It's like forgiving your coworker after they tried to get you fired, then inviting them to lunch every week, only to have them later pull the rug out from under you. March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March. Caesar walked into the Senate chamber. He had ignored the warnings, soothsayers, ominous dreams, even his wife Calpurnia begging him not to go. He sat down in his chair, ready for business. The senators crowded around him, and then the knives came out. The first stab was a shock. Then another, and another. 23 blows in total. Ancient writers say Caesar fought at first, but when he saw Brutus among the attackers, he gave up. Shakespeare later gave him the famous line, "Et tu, Brute." But historians think he probably just groaned and collapsed in silence, pulling his toga over his head as he fell at the base of Pompey's statue. Think about that for a second. The man who had conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, marched across the Rubicon, and risen to absolute power, cut down, not on the battlefield, but by his own colleagues, in the very institution he had once tried to dominate. The conspirators thought that they had saved the Republic, that by killing Caesar, they could restore the old balance of power. But if anything, they had only hastened its end, because Rome, after Caesar's death, did not return to calm, orderly republican government. It plunged into more chaos, more civil wars, and eventually the rise of a new leader, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. That young man would take the title Augustus, become the first Roman emperor, and bury the Republic once and for all. So Caesar's story is both triumph and tragedy. He was brilliant, bold, charismatic, one of the greatest leaders the world has ever seen. But his ambition and refusal to play by the rules destroyed the very system that had made Rome great. The Republic, born from a hatred of kings, ended with a dictator lying dead at the feet of Pompey's statue. And that's the lesson history leaves us. Institutions are fragile, ambition is powerful, and sometimes one man can tip the balance of an entire civilization. And that's where we'll close for today. The Roman Republic, born out of a hatred of kings and built on shared power, ultimately collapsed not with a single blow, but with years of erosion, corruption, inequality, violence, and finally, the ambition of men like Julius Caesar. His rise didn't just end the Republic, it revealed how fragile even the strongest institutions can be when people put power above principle. Before I sign off, let me share a little bit about myself. My name is James, and when I am not behind the mic, I'm in the classroom. I'm a middle school social studies teacher. Throughout the year, we go through different topics from ancient civilizations, the French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, and into the 19th and 20th century of U.S. history. With this podcast being so new, I thought tying in what I'm doing in school with what I'm sharing through the podcast would make sense. And then after this school year wraps up, I'll branch out into other corners of history, chasing the stories that don't always make it into my textbook. So, what's next? Well, if today's story was about how Rome's republic ended, next time we're going to go back to where it began. We'll look at the 12 tables, Rome's very first written laws. They may be crude, even harsh at times, but they gave the republic its backbone and left a legacy that still echoes in legal systems today. Until then, I'm James, and this has been Once Upon Yesterday. Thanks for listening, and remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about how we keep telling the story.